Good morning and welcome to the Green Means Go funding program kickoff. My name is Jessica and I work for SACOG. I'm on the Green Means Go funding program team and I'll be providing meeting support today. I want to cover a few ways that you can participate in the webinar. First, know that this webinar is being recorded. The recording and presentation slides will be shared via email to our contact list and also post on the SACOG website. There are two ways that you can provide comments or ask questions today. You can use the raise hand feature to notify us that you'd like to speak, or you could type your question or comment into the chat. And if you need Zoom support, please feel free to contact me via email or chat. I'll place those details into the chat box for you. And now I'll hand it off to my colleague, Greg Chu.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. I'm Greg Chu. I'm on the planning staff at SACOG. I'll be one of the team members of the Green Means Go team, so feel free to contact me at any time during the Green Means Go process. So we're going to kick off this workshop by having two of the elected officials that really led the organization to get Green Means Go and what we're going to do with it in the future. We're going to start off with Supervisor Gore from Placer County. She was the chair of the SACOG board in 2021 when we received the award. So with that, Gore.
Thank you, Greg. Well, good morning, everyone. It's I guess nice to see you virtually. Thank you for taking the time to join us for SACOG's kickoff webinar for the Green Means Go funding program. First, I just want to say thank you to all of you, our planning and public works staff across the 28 jurisdictions in the SACOG region who are joining us today. You are the folks who are going to help us get this work done. So thank you for taking your time today. Before our staff goes through the details of the new funding program, I wanted to take a step back and give some context for Green Means Go and the origination of this one-time funding coming to our region. Green Means Go is a key component of how our Sacramento region will implement our sustainable community strategy, including a 19% reduction in greenhouse gas targets set for the region by the state. You know, in our original plan actually is that we as a region went after funding just for our SACOG region to meet this 19% reduction in greenhouse gases. But this great idea that we advocated for a couple of years ended up leading to statewide funding. So we've got some very creative staff members really looking at how we best address some of the issues in our region. And Green Means Go funding that went statewide was really because of the efforts here at SACOG. So we know that our Sacramento region is very different in our characteristics than some of the other regions in the state of California, like the coastal regions. You know, we know that we're poised for growth to help meet the housing demand in the state of California. So for example, in Placer County, the county that I represent, we have a good deal of growth that's happening, a good deal of growth and development in West Placer County, as well as in the cities such as Roseville and Lincoln. And then there's also growth in our smaller suburban cities and the rural communities. So the solutions for our region in meeting these statewide targets really need to look different as well. The Green Means Go program has benefited from several years of outreach, like I said earlier, to sharpen our focus in accelerating infill development through infrastructure investments. So 25 of our 28 SACOG jurisdictions have nominated green zones in their community, in their town or suburban area or urban environments. And staff will share a little bit more about the green zones later today in the webinar and how they relate to the state funding. We've also heard how infill development in the Sacramento region faces its own set of challenges, including a different set of market dynamics compared to other areas in the state, as well as significant costs in updating the corridor level infrastructure. As chair of SACOG last year, I was really pleased to work with my colleagues across the 6-county region to successfully advocate for the Green Means Go funding. All 28 jurisdictions supported the program, either through resolutions or letters of support, and that was key in getting the funding. And now that the funding is secured, our staff is going to move forward in developing our Green Means Go funding round. And our intent really is to have the SACOG region lead the way in these efforts, and really show others in the state how it's done well. And so we're going to need your help with that. So now I am pleased to turn this over to my colleague and the current chair of SACOG, City of Sacramento Council Member Rick Jennings. And Rick's going to speak to some of the early actions the SACOG board has taken to shape the funding program. Rick?
Thank you, Supervisor Gore, and thank you for all your efforts and the work that you did as chair and as a member of the SACOG board. You guys did an incredible job, and as a result of the work that you did, I am pleased to announce that the SACOG region will receive nearly $34 million in state funding to reduce emissions, stimulate economic development, and further the quality of life in the Sacramento region. So if you'll join me in a virtual applause for Supervisor Gore and all the staff and everybody who made $34 million come into our region, I deeply appreciate it. So thank you for that virtual. You know, we believe that this funding can also position the region as an example of an innovative state, regional, and local partner. This workshop today will go over the top level components of the new funding program. Given this is a brand new program, there are so many other things that we need to work out, and we're going to welcome your input and coordination with the SACOG staff as they develop the program guidelines. You're going to be an important part of this, and I just want you to know that. So I'm glad that you're on this webinar today. While there are many things that we want to finalize, the SACOG board has already begun to narrow the program's focus in several ways. First, the broader Green Means Go program has 3 objectives: accelerate infill, accelerate travel options, and accelerate electric vehicle deployment. The 2022 Green Means Go program, funding program, will focus on the first of these objectives, accelerating infill development with a focus on infill housing. To that end, the program will look to fund non-transportation projects such as sewer, water, stormwater, and infrastructure which often serves as the most stubborn barrier, and you know this, the most stubborn barrier to realizing more infill development. Next, the program will target its investment within green zones, locally nominated. Did you hear me? Locally nominated areas that cities and counties have identified for infill development. And finally, the board has instructed staff to consider racial equity and inclusion, as well as economic equity in developing the funding guidelines for this program. I look forward, as many others do, to seeing this commitment reflected in the program's guidelines. Again, I want to thank you for your engagement as SACOG begins this new funding program. We look forward to your continued participation towards program guidelines that should be finalized by June, with an application period that will follow right after June of 2022. I'll now turn this over to the SACOG staff, who will walk through the overview of the Green Means Go funding program, including timing, eligibility, and key criteria. And again, thank you for joining us this morning for this webinar. This is one that I know is going to benefit our region for many, many years to come.
Well, thank you so much, Chair Jennings and Supervisor Gore. It's always a tough act to follow. We very much appreciate your time as well this morning to help kick off and give a little backstory of Green Means Go and some of the actions that the board has taken. And we know both of you need to drop off to go on to some other things. And then while they're doing that, I'll I'll introduce myself to the rest of us that are staying on. I'm Garrett Ballard-Rosa, also with SACOG. And you've heard from my colleague Jessica Lee and my colleague Greg Chu. The three of us will be the core team here at SACOG in standing up the Green Means Go funding program. As Chair Jennings said, we wanted to give this time to give you sort of the top level of this Green Means Go funding program. There's still a lot of work to be done, but we hope that the information we give you today is of substance, and we very much look forward to your input. And I am getting over a little bit of a cold, so I apologize for that. But on the upside, it helps me maybe be a little bit more slow in my cadence. I think those of you that know me know that I can just start rambling away. So this will help me sort of slow down and cover any points. We think we have about 20 minutes of content left. That kind of gets over those top level points. So plenty of time for questions and answers, and Greg and Jessica are monitoring the chat and the raise hand. So please feel free to interrupt us at any point with getting those questions in. So let's start first, excuse me, with what do we mean by the Green Means Go funding program? Well, if I were to put it in one sentence, I'd say something like it's looking to do planning and infrastructure investments that accelerate infill housing and locally adopted green zones. And why would I say that? Well, that's the first bullet we have right here on the screen. It's not exactly the pithiest sentence. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue. There's a lot in it. And so let's talk about a couple of those components. First part of it, planning and infrastructure. For those of you that are familiar with the first set of these state funds, which are called REAP 1, which we could talk about earlier, which we can talk about later, excuse me, that was focused mainly on planning. This Green Means Go funding program is focused on planning and infrastructure. And actually the emphasis is going to be on infrastructure. We think that's going to be the majority of the program. Investments that accelerate infill housing. And so we've gotten some good questions already about, some of the guidelines coming out from this have focused on infill. Really the emphasis is on infill housing. And so of course, if it's mixed use, that fits perfectly as well. But if you have a great concept about maybe a new office park or something like that, this isn't the program for you. There needs to be a housing component. And how is infill maybe defined? It's defined through this process we've gone through collectively in the past year or two in those locally nominated green zones. So the program will be making awards in those green zones. Excuse me. There's about 34 million that we'll be awarding. We're calling this the Green Means Go funding program. We know some of you might be coming through this from the REAP side, which is that state housing funding, and some of you might be coming through it from other ways. And so if you don't know what REAP means, that's not an issue. We're just, those of you that are tracking REAP 2, this is how the SACOG region is proposing to administer our component of the REAP 2. And we know there's confusion about there was that first wave of state REAP funds, which maybe had two components. This is the new wave of state funds that are coming to the regions. And there's also a little grant that SACOG received from the Strategic Growth Council. And we emphasize this and that there's a little bit of difference in when those funds need to be spent between the REAP and the SGC. And so we'll be talking about that in the program itself with some different timelines. And again, this is the Green Means Go funding program. This is not the SACOG transportation funding round there. Two distinct efforts. Of course, we're coordinating with our colleagues very closely on that. But as Chair Jennings mentioned up front, as we'll emphasize in this webinar, this is actually looking to award non-transportation infrastructure, that backbone of sewer, water, stormwater, that really has been that stubborn barrier to more infill housing. And of course, then there's the SACOG transportation round. A couple other differences. This program, the Green Means Go, is the full 6 counties, the full SACOG region, and our transportation round is a subset of that. So that's just a kind of overview of the Green Means Go program. We'll go into the specifics. And as I move into the next slide, I'll pause and we'll see if Greg and Jessica interrupt me if there's any questions so far.
So far, there's no questions in the chat, but for the audience, if there are questions at any time, feel free to either raise your hand or put something in the chat.
Thanks, Greg.
And Garrett, Garrett, can I make a recommendation?
Yeah.
Your sound is cutting out just a bit. I suggest turning your video off.
Okay, sounds good. Appreciate that, Jessica. So here's what we're doing in terms of the calendar, and this calendar is up on our website as well. We're starting off today with this webinar. You're the first. This is targeted to local jurisdictions, the cities and the counties. We'll also be reaching out to the development community, to special districts, to a new community community-based organization group we're standing up to really give the same information. We will be then going to our board in May with a draft set of guidelines. You'll also get those guidelines when they come out, those draft guidelines. And again, we welcome your input on that. And then we'll ask our board to act on those draft guidelines in June. For those of you that are familiar with the SACOG committee structure, this effort will be going through what we call our Land Use and Natural Resources Committee, which is meets after the Transportation Committee. So I know a lot of the transportation funding obviously goes through the Transportation Committee. This will actually be going through the Land Use or Natural Resources or LUNAR Committee. And so May will be a key item for them with those draft guidelines, and then June with the final guidelines for them to act on. At that same time, we very much hope to be having what we call a pre-application consultation with you all. It doesn't need to wait till May to start. If you're eager to get going and talk to us, we're ready as soon as you are. Feel free to reach out. But by the time the guidelines are out, we think there is a ton of value in sitting down with you on a one-on-one setting and talking through your concepts, and us weighing in with our perspective on the program guidelines. And so that May and June timeframe is when we hope to, it's not required, but it's strongly encouraged. At the same time, and we haven't quite talked about green zones yet, we will in a bit. We know that there was that process, and it's already been several months since we've sort of last talked about green zones. There'll be the opportunity to revisit your green zones. Most all jurisdictions have adopted green zones. A few are still working through it, and a few have not yet nominated. So if you're one that is not yet nominated and you would like to, there'd be opportunity. If there's that one that just needs to go through that final stretch to get over and finalize, there's an option. And if you have adopted green zones, you want to revisit them, we're more than willing to have that conversation. Excuse me. In that, this program will be, the awards it will be making will be in those targeted green zones. So if you do not have a green zone, you would not be eligible for the funds. But again, there's that opportunity to be working on your green zones as we're going through the standing up the program. And then we turn around in the summer with a call for projects. And here's where it's going to come into play a little bit of that. And it's not meant to confuse, but we have that one set of funds that have a much quicker time frame, and one set of funds that have a longer time frame. And so you'll see what we are calling an early activation program, excuse me, which we actually think we'll make our recommendation to our board for awards in October. And that's a much smaller portion of the program, and then the remainder of the program would be more in the early 2023 timeframe. And that call, we recognize there's a lot of programs, transportation otherwise going on right now. We try to the best we can to avoid the summer construction season, but we hope this is a broad enough call for projects time period that you're able to balance it, because we know that it is a workload to balance across all the programs. So I see a couple of chats coming in, so I'll pause and see if there's questions.
Yeah, Garrett, since you're on timeline, there is one timeline question specific, and I think you partially covered or did cover it. It says, if we want to modify our green zone, when is the window for that?
Yeah, and so we tag it to that pre-application consultation. That's when we would prefer. And so that's sort of that orange line, and we can maybe update that and see if we can put consultation and green zone revisions. We understand that that you might need to go to your own board or council, and so we want to be a little bit flexible. So we don't have a final sort of like deadline of when they need to be revised, but we prefer to get them done sooner rather than later. But for sure, the final deadline is by the time you turn in your application, you need to have your green zones squared up for this cycle.
Okay, thanks, Garrett. Another timeline question is, when is the money available to start spending, and when does it need to be spent by? Yeah,
excellent question. I'm glad you raised that. It was on my talking points and I completely jumped over it. So the early activation, which is 3 million of the 34, so a small part of it, but important part, will be available immediately, but it needs to be spent by October of 2023. So we'll talk about how that plays into eligibility, because that's going to be a different type of project moving forward, because it has a really quick turnaround of October 2023. It needs to be spent. The balance needs to be obligated by mid 2024, and then needs to be spent by June of 2026. So seems a little bit farther away, but we know how these infrastructure things take a long time. So both sets of funds do have a more immediate time frame. Most of these will be in June of 2026. We're still working with the state on the mechanism of these funds. Will it be a reimbursement base, or will it be an upfront payment? We don't have final clarity from them. They've said in our conversations that they want to employ the model they've used in REAP 1, which is sort of a hybrid, where SACOG doesn't have these funds yet. We can apply to the state and get get the fund in sort of tranches, and that would hopefully facilitate the ability to get the funds then to the awardees. Last point I would say, and then Greg, let me know if there's any more questions on timeline, is there's also a corresponding statewide competitive program that using these REAP funds. And so we just want to make sure that the region is aware of this. It will most likely be on a similar time frame of a call for projects in the summer and awards by the end of the year. There's $30 million in that statewide program, but we very much would hope, and in part of the pre-application consultation, want to be talking with you all of, for sure, at least a project coming forward from the SACOG region, that state competitive program. So I'll pause there and Greg, see if there's any other questions.
Just a request to just repeat about the timeline on when the funds have to be either obligated or spent. Just repeat the dates.
Thank you. Yeah. So the first tranche of funds, a small amount, 3 million, need to be spent by October of 2023. So that has a very quick turnaround. And that's why we're calling it that sort of early activation. The balance of the funds, so over the 30 million, needs to be obligated by June of 2024, needs to be spent by June of 2026.
Okay, thanks. We have a couple of other questions, but they're more on content of the types of funds and how they can be used. So I'll list those off when you get to that slide here. There's no further timeline questions.
Great. Let me advance my slides. So yeah, let's turn a bit then to eligibility. And we're going to get after this into the uses. So we look forward to those questions. As I mentioned up front, this is a 6-county program, and that the awards will be in a green zone. I wanted to just stop real quick and pull up our green zone map, if I can find it, just in case we need to remind ourselves where the green zones live. So here we are on SACOG's webpage. I'll just go to the home page real quick. And if you go to projects and green means go, and you click here on green zones, I think Jessica can send out this link as well. Here's the map of all the green zones that have been adopted to date. So if you're, need to remind yourself of, where our green zone's at, we very much encourage you to check this map, and double check, make sure that we mapped it correctly. If it's on the map, right, it's your adopted green zone, and let us know if we missed anything when we were doing the mapping. We just wanted to make sure that we got some questions too about what's the status of our green zone, and this was we had some staff turnover as well, so this was another team that now we're picking up and running with. So if you have any questions about your green zone, definitely start with the map, but obviously ask us as well about did we ever finalize that? We could talk through it, but here's the map, and as revisions are made, we'll be updating the map.
Garrett, while we have the map up,
yeah.
You don't need to bring it back up, but just really quickly, a question was whether or not Midtown Sacramento is in the green zones.
So yeah, here's City of Sacramento, and so elements of Midtown Sacramento are in its green zone.
Okay, that's the only green zone question that we had.
Perfect. Let me just jump back now to here. Okay. And in terms of who could be the eligible agency to apply for this, there is some flexibility in the state guidelines. Something I've also jumped over in one of my talking points is, this is a state funding. It's coming from HCD. We are very excited about it. They have not yet finalized their own framework, and there's a draft framework out, but there's it's a brand new program from them as well, and so we are waiting on them to finalize it. We feel very confident that Green Means Go is going to align with their ultimate guidelines. As I believe Supervisor Gore said, this was sort of the inspiration for the broader program, but we do need to emphasize, I should have done it up front, this is our draft structure to date. We don't anticipate any major changes at the state level, but since it's not finalized, we just are cognizant that they are still working on the sort of broader objectives for the statewide program. With that said, as I said, there's that broader sort of statewide draft guidelines sees flexibility in eligible project sponsors. Our proposal so far, but we welcome input, is that the city or county would be the lead agent or the lead applicant in this program. And we understand that some of the infrastructure or other investments being made, you might not be the lead agency. And then you could list then the implementing agency on your application as well. But our thought is to have the city or the county be the lead applicant. And then if you're not a full service jurisdiction, if there's another type of project that there's a implementing applicant, you would just list that in the application. So any questions about sort of eligibility from an application standpoint, and we'll turn next to eligibility from sort of the uses standpoint.
Just to reiterate something you said, a question was just that this money is 100% state money. There's no mixing of federal monies in that. Is that correct, Derek?
So a lot of this money comes from the federal, one of the COVID stimulus packages, and so it's and some of it is just pure state money. So it's being administered at the state level, but it does have federal, I guess the detail, if you will. There's a more sophisticated way to say this. So it's federal dollars that have been passed to the state. The state has paired that with a little bit of its own money, but so it is a combination of state and federal dollars.
So I guess that raises the follow-up question: is does that trigger NEPA and I realize we're maybe getting into details that we may not have direction enough from the board, but would these funds, since they're originally sourced as federal, would that trigger the NEPA process?
Yeah, great question. We will raise that with our state partners. We don't have an answer right now, but it's a very good question. And so we'll try to get clarity on right how that would be interpreted, if it would trigger NEPA or not. It's a very good question.
That's all on the eligibility. There is a question about coordination with PG&E. I don't know if you want to take that now or not. I can. And the question is, has there been any coordination with PG&E regarding its capacity to serve in additional infill development, especially for EV charging?
Yeah, and so Green Means Go has benefited from almost 2 years of outreach, and a lot of it's been at the city county, but a lot of it's been also at the special districts. And so sewer, water districts, and utility districts. And so we have coordinated with SMUD and PG&E. We'll talk a little bit in some of the sort of draft criteria about the advantages of partnerships. And so we do think that the utility, right, would be a key partner depending on your type of project. We have been coordinating with them and the other special districts, and we will be having a webinar with the same content just for the special districts.
Two other questions that came in, both related to if my site's not in the green zone, can it be added in? And if there was a mistake from what a jurisdiction submitted for their green zones and it's not reflected in this, could that be added in or corrected?
Yeah, the answer is yes to both. If it's a mistake, for sure, that's easy. We've already a couple of sponsors have pointed out a few minor things. We appreciate that. We will be more than happy to update it. If it's a sort of new sort of part added to the green zone, we would need to go through that same process, right? That it meets the criteria of the original green zone nomination. It's within one of those community types within our blueprint long range plan, right? That the member agency, right, in its own planning efforts shows the capacity for infill, and that the long range plan shows vehicle miles traveled reduction. So for sure, there's the ability to be rethinking the green zones. We're hoping that for those that have their adopted green zones, there aren't major changes, but we know, market changes, communities, corridors change and progress. So if there are revisions you want to make, we're more than happy to have that conversation, but it would need to go through that same sort of criteria that we went through in the original green zone nomination.
And if somebody were asking from a private development standpoint, or from not the agency, but a partner to the agency, they would have to contact the planning department. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. For this program, the green zones are locally nominated, i.e. the city or county would be the one that would be coordinating with us. And of course, whatever partners they need to bring to that is all the better, but they would be the ones coordinating with us to get that green zone updated.
This may be getting ahead of ourselves here, but are there prevailing wage requirements with this money?
So the expectation is that this is public funds. And so It could trigger prevailing wage. This is definitely not an area of my expertise, and so you all will probably know this much better than I do. But the thought is that this is public resources, and one of the reasons, not all, but one of the reasons with the focus on the backbone infrastructure is oftentimes those are already using public funds, and so it will be as sponsors are putting together their own proposals or projects, right? That's something you'll definitely need to be cognizant of. We do think that the award could trigger prevailing wage. And again, I would say this is not my area of expertise, so I look forward to if you have input just from your experience working through this on that. We'll look forward to that. We're also coordinating with some other partners that are very familiar with that issue.
Let's see. Again, I don't know how much you want to get into the details or if you want to get through your presentation. We have another question about just eligibility of projects.
Why don't we jump next? I'm going to jump slides because that's what we're talking about now, is just kind of like what type of projects are we talking about? And then if I don't cover that, we'll for sure get back to that question. And so, as we mentioned, excuse me, we envision that the mainstay part of this program will be the infrastructure investment, the capital infrastructure, through that Green Means Go sort of development with cities and counties and partners, right? It's really identified that as one of the key barriers to the infill development. And so we're thinking that, the mainstay part of the eligibility would be the waste water, stormwater, water upgrades, or new infrastructure coming in. And again, this is not the transportation infrastructure. This is the sort of wet and dry utility infrastructure. So that would be sort of the larger part of the program, but there's still the ability to have some planning, as we mentioned up front, right? Planning and infrastructure investments. And really, the planning is really thinking about, like, we very much recognize that the green zones across the region are on a continuum, right? Some are more in the visioning stage and some are sort of chomping at the bit and are really, probably poised to have that infill development come in. Right, we want to make sure there's resources available to have the sort of planning activities to get the next cycle of green zones come available. Examples of potential projects that might come through in the planning sort of track. Is it maybe a rezone within your green zone or some other policy change you're making at the local level? Is it a technical infrastructure study, right? You need to get a better sense of what's actually there and what's needed. Is it maybe a market readiness study? We'll talk a bit about some of the emphasis in this program around engagement. So maybe you need to do some of the community engagement or anti-displacement strategies. You could definitely use the planning funds for that. We are making available in the Green Means Go program what we call a master procurement, where SACOG is going to pre-qualify a suite of vendors that we think can accomplish some of those activities we just mentioned to. By no means you need to use those technical resources if you get an award, but it's available for you, and it helps a bit with the procurement because then it's already pre-qualified, so you could actually just get up and running. You wouldn't have to go through your own procurement process. So again, one of the ways we're trying to streamline this, right, is we're going to pre-qualify a bench of consultants that we think can help with these types of planning studies and activities. And you're not required to by any means, but if you feel like that technical resource is a good fit, you could just sort of piggyback on our master procurement, sort of speeds things up a bit. And then finally, we have a very broad sort of implementation activity. And then again, this is the early activation program where we have that smaller amount of money with that real quick turnaround that we kind of want to preserve the flexibility by design. And it could even much be at a sort of site level activity of maybe getting the project over the hump and ready to sort of market viability or feasibility. And we distinguish that because it's a different funding stream. And so let me just go now to the next slide, which maybe hopefully gets this a little bit clearer, right, about how this kind of then translates into maybe the draft structure of what we're thinking. So again, an early activation program, it's flexible, it could be site-specific, $3 million available, very much the quick turnaround, right? Awards by this October, use the money by October of next year. And then the larger program, which is sort of a planning element to it, and then the capital element to it. Something I failed to mention on the earlier slide, definitely the capital one, it's envisioning more of the sort of backbone infrastructure to serve a corridor, right? The early activation could be focused more on specific sites. the capital program is more focused on that green zone corridor. And then we anticipate for the planning and the capital program, right, a call in summer and then fall and awards in March. We say on the slide, maybe earlier for the planning awards, but something we're eager for input on is if we could tweak the calendar a little bit and get those awards recommended to our board, by the end of this year. Would that be a value add for you as the member agencies and the project sponsors? On the capital side, we think that the award in March 2023 is probably where we're going to land. So again, a lot thrown at you, but this is our proposal so far. Our draft proposal we haven't gone through our board yet. So this is just our sort of early ideas. The three elements aren't meant to confuse you. I know, we pull out the early activation just because it's a different stream of funding, and then we separate the planning and the infrastructure, and that those are the two parts in the sort of the REAP element of the funding. So I'm going to stop there, and I imagine there's probably some good questions about this.
Yeah, we received a cluster of questions about eligibility. So let's start with the most fundamental question is our transportation projects eligible? And then if the answer is yes, then there's a bunch of questions about specific types of eligibility. So are transportation projects eligible?
Our proposal is that this will fund non-transportation infrastructure so that transportation projects would not be eligible. And again, the thinking is that the majority of this money is coming from housing community development. That the goal is to see the housing come in. And then our pretty substantial outreach over the last 2 years with cities and counties and partners, right? The thing that came up over and over and over again is that wet and dry utilities, that backbone infrastructure as a barrier. So our proposal is that transportation projects in this program, Green Means Go, would not be eligible. Of course, SACOG is standing up a transportation funding round. It's not a Green Means Go funding round, but there will be opportunities for transportation funding through SACOG through that transportation round. But in this program, we're proposing that it does not do transportation investments.
Okay, thanks, Garrett. There were related questions, but that one's the most fundamental about whether or not their transportation is available, since it's not. But there were questions about sidewalks and local streets and so forth, but those are all moot questions with that response. There is another question: can this be a standalone infrastructure project, or does it have to be tied to a specific development?
It does not have to be tied to a specific development. We're going to jump next, I think, to sort of draft criteria. I think what we're going to be asking for is, right, the ability to connect whatever infrastructure investment that goes in with the ultimate sort of corridor sort of vision and feasibility for housing coming in. So we know that sometimes, these corridors might be on different continuums, but it's kind of like for those of you that have worked with us on the transportation side, sort of a community design model, where we very much hope that Public Works and planning are coordinating on this. And so it doesn't have to be site specific, but there does need to be that through line about how the investment is going to sort of accelerate or lead to or activate more infill housing.
Okay, I had another question. What happens if you have rezones to do for the regional housing needs allocation process now, but funding may not be available till later? Can a jurisdiction do rezones, GPAs, general plan amendments in 2022 and then apply for reimbursement in 2022, 2023? So basically do the rezones and then get the reimbursement later is the question.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's probably one of the specifics we'll need to think through. So we don't have an answer right now for that question. I think conceivably within the planning track, but the question in that planning track is going to be, how is this going to lead to these efforts kind of above and beyond? And so we very much recognize that you're also working very heavily on RENA and housing elements and everything. And so we'll coordinate, Greg and I and our housing colleagues will coordinate on that good question. And so we don't have an answer right now.
That's it for current questions.
All right, good. So the last thing we want to talk about, or maybe the last major area, is some of the kind of criteria we are thinking about in the program. You see 5 on the screen. The first 4 come straight from the state and their draft guidelines, and we don't anticipate any major changes there. And then the last one is one that our SACOG board instructed staff to add. to the program. So I'll talk a little bit about each of the five. Excuse me. The first is accelerating infill housing. Hopefully that's come across as one of the key objectives to date in this program. And if not, I have definitely failed in my presentation in my slides. So again, probably the key tagline: how can this investment help accelerate more infill housing? And so that's definitely going to be part of the application. The second part is how it's going to help reduce vehicle miles traveled. And so in this sort of bucket of outcomes, you can definitely be talking about how the sort of corridor sort of situates or benefits from other types of investments. And so this is not funding transportation investments, but maybe there's other work going on in the corridor, right? How the housing coming in can help with the jobs housing balance, or help with accessibility to the neighborhood services. And so there'll be questions about how that situates in terms of vehicle miles traveled as well, because that's a criteria that the state's tracking. The third is implementing the sustainable community strategy. That's an element of the region's long-range plan. We sort of see everything we're doing in this program as implementing the sustainable community strategy. So we put it up there, and that it's one of the things listed in the state guidelines, but I don't anticipate there being a specific question about that. As I said, any of these other four are going to be helping implement the sustainable community strategy. The fourth is one that the housing planners will be very aware of, and we'll be sure to make sure that we give the resource in the application as well. But the efforts to affirmatively further fair housing. So there's the broader sort of goal of accelerating infill housing, but then also the goal of affirmatively furthering fair housing. In the guidelines the states put together, they take this to mean meaningful actions to overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities. And so how are you going to be in your proposals and concepts you're putting forward, thinking about how the project doesn't, focuses on infill housing writ large, but also on the furthering fair housing. And then finally, and it related in some aspects, the economic and racial equity and inclusion. There's some draft language in the state that's not finalized yet about this. And we'll definitely be looking in the application itself for sorts of evidence of engagement. And we recognize that projects are on a different level of continuum. Maybe in the planning track, you want to be using the funds for engagement, but evidence of engagement is not only a screening criteria, but evaluation criteria. So these we think are going to be the sort of performance outcomes within the program. I'll talk next about the other sort of criteria, but I'll stop and see if there's questions on these outcomes.
Yeah, so Garrett, in the early part of your presentation, you mentioned that the multi-year goal of Green Means Go is infill housing, of course, but also to accelerate travel options and to accelerate electric vehicle deployment. Since this funding round is focused on infill housing, when would the other two objectives of accelerating travel options and accelerating EV deployment, when and where would that be discussed?
Good question. So this is a one-time state funding. We very much hope that working collectively, like as our chair said, we could be a sort of model to the state of the state, regional, local sort of partnership. But this is a one-time state funding. So as of yet, we cannot guarantee there'll be another funding program, because this is not a recurring revenue stream for us. So this is, until we get the next wave of Green Means Go funding, which we very much hope we can, we very much hope we can continue to work with all of you to demonstrate the need to the state. There's just this funding. So I'd say in the immediate term, those other sort of objectives of Green Means Go can be met in SACOG's transportation funding round. Our colleagues on the transportation team are building up that program. And again, those are recurring revenues that are administered in the region. And so we will be doing, funding rounds in the transportation side. And again, it's not tied to Green Means Go, but objectives such as, travel mobility and electrification have fit within the guidelines of the transportation program.
Okay. The next question is about what about is purchasing affordable housing deed restrictions on current commercial sites within green zones? Would that be an eligible use of this program?
So probably it would be within that sort of activation or planning, right? Because the infrastructure side is looking at the corridor level, it's not looking at specifics. And so it could be an eligibility it could be eligible within that early activation side of things, but it's going to be then making the case of how that's going to lead to more infill housing.
Question. So since water, sewer, drainage, conveyance facilities are oftentimes underneath roadways, is it expected that the local agencies would fund the roadway part of this funding to complete the underground portion?
Yeah, I mean, so this one is trying to focus on that backbone infrastructure. So, right, it's focusing on the non-transportation side. There's opportunities to pair that with applications on the transportation funding round, or to pair it with your own local resources, like you would do on any sort of corridor investment. So this is focused on the non-transportation side of the infrastructure.
And would that include broadband?
Yeah, for sure it can include broadband. I think the thing for broadband, again, is you need to make the case about how that's going to lead to more infill housing. Is that the key barrier from getting more infill? And maybe it is. For sure it's eligible, but just make sure you're thinking about, do you have that use case about why broadband was kind of like the thing holding everything up.
Okay. Next question, does the project need to have CEQA or environmental clearance, entitlements, approvals prior to the application, or at least prior to the award?
No, it will depend on where it falls in that continuum, because a lot of times, and even in the capital side of it, you might be moving the project through project development as well. And so, but we are gonna, this is something we need to refine. And so let me just, we need to look at it a bit closer with the use of the funds being by 2026. That's something we need to look a bit closer at. And if anything, we'd be worried if projects are not at least showing where they are on that continuum of project development. There will be, I'm going to talk about this in a second, like there will be a criteria on deliverability. So we like we do on the transportation side, we'll ask a deliverability review to look at this. And if it looks like the project wouldn't be able to, use it by 2026, that could be a flag.
That's it for chat questions. I don't know if Jessica has any raised hands or not.
No raised hands.
Okay, well, yeah, great segue then to the kind of complementary criteria. As I just mentioned, the deliverability side of things, cost effectiveness, right, is something we'll want to make sure is at least considered. But the one I really want to focus on is leverage. I think there was a question earlier on about, partners. We haven't finalized exactly what leverage could look like, but here's some 3 ideas that we're thinking through. One is a match itself, right? Is the sponsoring agency, what else are they doing, including on the project itself in terms of a match? The second is, right, what work many other partners are doing. Maybe it's PG&E or SMUD. They talked about utilities, right? Maybe it's transit or active transportation, or sort of some transportation investment that, again, is not being funded by this program, but it's being put in the corridor in complement. But the third one, which might be a new one, is what we're calling a policy match, which is what has the city or county done from a policy standpoint to sort of help spur housing within that green zone. And so, again, we're not at this point ready to say it's going to be all 3 or none of these 3, but these are the ideas within the leverage that we're thinking through. And I wanted to add that idea of policy match is something we're really, at top of our mind, because we recognize, right, on the financial side, right, it's, there's a lot going on. It's always hard to, put your own revenues as match. And partners, you might not be able to control what some other things are doing, but in terms of the policy side, what the city or county has done or can commit to do in terms of policy to support infill housing, well, I think is going to very much be a key part of the leverage question. Great, I'll pause there to see if there's any questions on the criteria.
No questions in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, so then the last part is then, just how to stay involved. As we mentioned up front, we highly encourage in the sort of May, June timeframe to be having those one-on-ones with us, but no need to wait till then. If you got a concept or concepts and you're excited to talk through them, please reach out to any of us 3, Jessica, Greg, or myself. We're happy to have that one-on-one meeting. As I said as well, we're going to share the guidelines. If you're on this invite list, you'll get the draft guidelines as they come out. Welcome your comments on those. If there's things we talked about today, like some really good, more specific questions that we need to think about as a team, right? from what you heard today, please just shoot us an email and let us know. We will be doing some webinars for the other stakeholder groups, so we'll get those other stakeholders engaged. And then we have our webpage where we're going to have all the stuff. We have the calendar up, and as we get more information, we'll start putting it up there too. So very much, I think as our board chair said up front, brand new program, so always things to think through, and there's still things we need to finalize, and hopefully we're at that good stage, and hopefully you felt there was valuable information of there's enough substance of what we're thinking in the program, and everything's not set yet, and we look forward to working with you and other partners throughout the region in getting this thing up and running by the summer.
Okay. Thanks, Garrett. We received a couple more questions. First is, so for affordable housing projects, there's affordability requirements often. Is that seen as a policy match and or incentives for affordability? So jurisdictions have to meet a certain requirement to service a certain window of incomes. Can that be seen as the match?
Yeah, for sure. That could be one example of a policy match. It's something a jurisdiction is doing to try to get more infill housing. For sure, that could be an example.
And then a second set of questions, what agency is going to have a role in overseeing these grant funds? And then is there also an oversight in right-of-way certifications? And since they're not transportation projects, the assumption is it would not be Caltrans. So what state agencies overseeing the use of these funds, and what about right-of-way certifications?
So the overseeing state agency is actually it's Housing Community Development, Office of Planning and Research, Strategic Growth Council, and California Air Resources Board. So it's actually a consortium of 4 state agencies. So it is a kind of new structure for them. And so it may be a little bit of to be determined on kind of what that sort of translates to, but we will be doing our reporting to them. If you receive an award through this, you'll need to do an annual report. Hopefully it's very streamlined, right? And we will compile all that. And so we do have reporting functions through that consortium of 4 state agencies. For your second question, I don't think we have an answer yet. Greg, could you repeat it? But I think it's something we need to coordinate with.
Yeah, it's about overseeing right-of-way certifications.
Yep, good question. So we'll coordinate on that, because this is not funding's not coming from Caltrans, it's coming from those other 4 state agencies. So we'll get an answer to that.
That's it on chat questions. Jessica, are there any hand raised questions?
We do not have any hands raised, no.
Good. Well, thanks for bearing with us, and sorry I was a little under the weather today, but we appreciate all the great questions. And like I said, we hope this was of use and of substance to you. We recognize that not everyone could be with us right now. There's no real way to get a time that worked for everybody. So we will send out this recording. We'll send out the slides, and we'll get this up on our webpage. So definitely, if you like, well, what did Garrett say on slide 4? That we'll have those resources available. And then, probably the final point to emphasize is Greg and Jessica and I are available, and we're ready. We're up and running on the Green Means Go program. So any questions you have as they come in, just please feel free to reach out. Great. With that, or Greg, you're going to add something?
Nope, just we received a couple of thank yous from participants. So thank you for coming.
We'll pause and let you get on with the rest of your day, and we look forward to coordinating with you as we stand up the program. Thanks everyone for your time this morning.